Game 1 is in the books for the Winnipeg Jets and St. Louis Blues, and Winnipeg came out the victors. Game 2 is coming later tonight, and we expect another evening of fireworks.
You're Locked On the Hockey Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey friends, and welcome to today's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you enjoy what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. Most of all, though, we just love and appreciate your support. Tonight's episode, obviously, we are walking through the start of this Blues and Jets series. Obviously, for Winnipeg, this was really, I don't want to say, a particularly high-pressure moment, but, in a lot of ways it was, right? You are the number one ranked team in the NHL. You have not a lot of recent playoff success to really talk about. And, let's be honest, Blues fans have kind of held 2019 over us for a decent bit. As soon as the playoff series was confirmed, it's like, oh, here we go. The Blues going on a very similar run to the way that they did when they won the Cup. Is history going to repeat itself? So the Jets had to come out of game one with a lot at stake, a lot of pressure, some really big expectations. And for the first half of the game, the Jets were not really at the races. They weren't bad, or at least I don't think the net was. But personally, I felt that the team was well below their standard. Right, the puck management was poor. The Jets looked very, I would say, antsy. And so it just felt like Winnipeg was ill at ease. And then, some early goals conceded on some questionable penalty calls and some iffy decision making, and maybe a couple of moments where you'd hope the Jets PK might clear the front of the net and Helly would have a better sight line. Didn't really happen. And so, there just were some individual moments where players made some uncharacteristic mistakes, things that don't usually happen. Lowry on the first power play that the Jets conceded, he went to the blue line and got really aggressive and ended up leaving Robert Thomas wide open for a beautiful shot. And then Morrissey, unfortunately, ceded a shot lane to Kyrou. And you would really hope that the goal wouldn't go in because Kyrou's shooting from above the circles. But the problem was, there was supposed to be somebody clearing out the front of the goal. And instead, I think it was Sunkovist who was actually, screening Helly, right? And then you had another incident later at even strength where Shen got hit with the puck, couldn't clear it properly. It created a chaos sequence in front of the goal, and Sunkovist, scored the third Blues goal. So there were these individual moments where the Jets just didn't quite seem to be comfortable. But then about halfway through and really towards the end of the second period, something started to flip. The Jets started to wake up. There was a little more momentum. And I don't know, Winnipeg recently, I feel, has played at a level to where they're never quite out of any game. I think the Jets have shown a lot of backbone, a lot of resolve this year, and that happened again in this game. Once Winnipeg really started to turn things on, they really did start to come alive, and it came from some individually fantastic moments, right? Like Scheifele had a little bit of a lucky moment on the power play in the first period, a great goal that, well, again, a little bit fortunate, but you'll take it. The thought was there. But then you had the fourth line later in that period also kind of showing up, and when Winnipeg was maybe a little shaky, the fourth line, I thought, really showed out, and Jared Anderson-Dolan gets his first goal as a Winnipeg Jet. He's been pretty nice on the fourth line, and I know that there were a lot of questions about him coming in. So far, I feel like he's certainly done well with his ice time. At first, it looked like Barron might have tipped it, but he ended up getting it, so that's great. And then, the third period is when really the Jets, proper, right, really took over. When I say that, I mean that Winnipeg basically locked it down. The Blues had almost no 5v5 offense. They couldn't get anything going. The Jets actually held them to 17 shots on goal total, which is very similar to what happened in the 4-0 win a couple of weeks ago. Obviously, the scoreline's a little more unfavorable for Winnipeg, but well, relatively speaking, right, in a shutout versus, conceding a few opportunities. But in this case, one thing that I think, again, has really stood out about this Jets team is that when their backs are against the wall, in so many instances, they really have stepped up this year. And this time, the top line, which I thought had looked pretty good for much of the night, maybe struggled to find a little more of the space that they were hoping for. But, Shifley, Connor, and Iafallo were generally doing a lot to create space and try to score, finally played hero. And it was really funny because I was like, coming into the third period, I thought, you know what? I think it's going to be Iafallo that scores one. I couldn't tell you why. I just had this feeling that it was going to be one of those greasy playoff style goals. And guess what happened? A lucky bounce off the backboards. Iafallo, who's such a smart player, and I think that that's really started to stand out alongside Shifley and Connor. Very hardworking, and that I think is where he's able to keep plays alive. He's able to find himself in good, either scoring or defensive opportunities, depending on which side of the ice he's on. He just constantly seems to be in the right spot at the right moment. And here he golfs one very quickly past Binnington. Jordan never even saw it, didn't even have time to react, and the Jets tied it up. And then that top line again, right at the end of the game, in a beautiful set play where Shifley dives around the circle, races behind the net, and basically creates this kind of hook and reel sort of situation, finds Connor wide open off of the pool. It is a 4-3 win. Lowry wraps it up. And, I just feel like this was the sort of defining period early in a playoff series that tells you that the Jets know that this year is going to be different. They don't feel like it is. They know that it's going to be different because they are going to make it happen. And so I walked away feeling very impressed. The early nerves, the early puck management, that stuff went away, and the Jets did really well. If there was one particular thing that I do think might be worth keeping an eye on, Stanley and Shen, I think really did struggle as a pairing, especially early under the pressure. And it's notable that when it came to the third period, you had other situations with the top four defenders. Like Sandberg had a couple of bad giveaways. I think the worst one was probably the breakaway through the neutral zone that Kyrou had to step on, because like Sandberg was kind of turnstiled. And this is not something that you often see from him, but he'll have moments where, like any defender, he'll make a bit of a boo-boo. This one is pretty egregious, but usually in the past, he's been able to clean up after himself. This one, he really had to lean on Helly for. So big moment there. Morrissey and DeMello had a couple of more uneven shifts, although I thought that they were generally fine enough. The thing with the Stanley Shen pairing is that, under the Blues pressure where St. Louis came out swinging and immediately put Winnipeg under some real heat, that pairing, I think, really spent too many shifts in its own end. So many of St. Louis's early offensive zone possessions were because that pairing and the forwards really couldn't get out of the defensive zone. It's where I really feel like you want to look at Miller. I'm like fine having one of Stanley or Shen in the lineup, but I just don't think you can play them together. And I think Arniel ended up agreeing because in the third period, that pairing as a duo didn't really play. And in fact, we didn't really see Stanley for, I would say, the last 10 minutes or so. Which, I think is probably a bit of a reflection of what was happening on the ice. The Jets trying to defend the lead and try to, well, in this case, it was more of a tie situation, but, looking for that game winning goal, trying to keep things relatively even, though not lose your composure. And so I do wonder if we see Miller later in the series. The skating I thought wasn't going to be a problem for that pairing in this series, but St. Louis immediately dialed up the pace and kind of threw caution to that narrative. So we'll have to see how that pans out. I mean, I know Arniel really likes both Luke and Logan, so I don't know that we'll see a pairing change. But tomorrow, or obviously later this afternoon's practice, will be interesting to see the lines. But overall, man, I think the Jets really came out with a statement game. I think that this is more or less the start that they wanted. Now it is time to continue it. And I want to chat about game two and what I might imagine could be some potential adjustments. We'll chat about those in just a brief moment. But before we go too much further, did want to let you know about our friends and partners at Gametime. The Stanley Cup playoffs are here, and if you've ever been to a live NHL playoff game, it's unlike anything in the world. The intensity, the speed, the energy in the building, it is next level. As somebody who's gone to Winnipeg Game 3 versus Nashville 2017-2018, let me tell you, get yourself to an NHL playoff game. Thanks to Gametime, though, getting in the door is easier and more affordable than ever. Gametime is the fastest way to grab playoff tickets, even for those must-see matchups. And prices actually drop as puck drop gets closer, and with last-minute deals, you can save up to 60% off. Save up to 60% buying last minute for sports or concerts, comedy, theater, and so many other events. And of course, you get panoramic seat views, so when you're buying your tickets, you know what you're looking at, and you actually get all-in pricing, so there's no hidden fees or surprise charges at checkout. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, that's code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Download the Gametime today. Gametime app today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Hey friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we are chatting a little bit about, obviously, Winnipeg coming up for a pretty massive game two. We are all pretty excited, I think. Game one, the Jets set some very early expectations. That was a tough one, but Winnipeg held true despite maybe some early struggles, maybe a couple of things that I think that they wouldn't be as thrilled with. They're never going to be perfect, right? Not especially in a very intense environment, a moment where there's a lot of pressure on you. You are literally the opening game of the whole NHL playoffs, and the weight of tons of President's Trophy expectations and the memory of past playoff failures is sitting on your shoulders. And yet the Jets, through it all, I thought really put on a good show. And I feel like game two is going to be more of the same, but from the start. Winnipeg recently, and for the past few months, I've said it on many previous episodes, but they have played a very airtight defensive game. The Blues, especially from the last 25-ish minutes, I think they registered one shot on goal, which is that's pretty darn mind-boggling. That 25-minute period, and I think this might have been from Dmitry Filipovich, who had this somewhere, or somebody else on Twitter, but basically from the time that the game was 3-2 Blues to the time where it was 5-3 Jets, the Blues really could not get anything going. So if the Jets kind of start off with that suffocating defense again, I think it's going to be a very long night for St. Louis. The Blues are one of those teams where they are good, and I think that they've done really well with their late season resurgence. But this Jets team is so disciplined and so tough to break down and get past that if you don't break Winnipeg's quick defensive back checks and pressures, their ability to recover the puck and get back up the ice is enough to kind of push the advantage really in Winnipeg's favor, right? The Jets play a speedy-ish game that may not rely explicitly on skating speed. I think the way that Winnipeg has really offered, off the puck support and pressure against opposing puck carriers to get the puck back, back into the offensive zone has really worked a treat. And they're doing it without guys like Ehlers and Velarde, who are some of their biggest top 9 guys. Ehlers in particular is a critical piece of Winnipeg's, transition game, and they've really made do without him. Now, that doesn't mean that I think that they are okay and will survive without him against the Colorado. I just think in this particular series, the Jets have proven that because they can kind of compensate elsewhere, right now they are mitigating the damage. I think if you start to get into a track meet sort of series, that's where you really do need an Ehlers. Nick is crucial in these kinds of games, but I think for this opening round, I'm not really expecting that to be the style. Unless something drastically changes, I think, the Blues have some really great skill up front, and you look at their top 6 of Neighbors, Thomas Buchnevich, Snugarud, Shen, and Kyrou, and there's a lot to work with there. And then you factor in a guy like, Bolduc in your bottom 6, and you feel like you have a pretty reasonably competitive group, but it's not going to be enough against a Jets team that has shown, some serious gumption. They are really tight defensively, and offensively, they've really gotten to a good point of simplifying their game enough to be dangerous, right? I think that Iafallo goal is really the sort of hardtack, sort of gritty, grindy playoff kind of goal that you're just going to have to try and crack, because the Blues didn't really give the Jets as much space as I think Winnipeg would have liked. The underlying numbers looked fantastic for the Jets, but I think in practice, it was still harder to get to some of those softer slot areas And even when the Jets finally got some fantastic grade A chances, Bennington was, fast enough and reactive enough to make some huge stops. So this team is just not easy to crack. It is a tough nut. And even with the home ice advantage, it is not an easy out. It's why, I was contemplating whether Minnesota or the Blues would be a better matchup for Vegas. Both teams have some very glaring weaknesses. And if you look at St. Louis, the depth and the defensive situation are not ideal. But, this team is still dangerous. It's still strong. I think game 2, though, I'm expecting a little more of a lopsided scoreline for the Jets. I think Winnipeg's going to tighten up. I think Hellebuck is going to pitch a really good performance. I saw a lot of stuff directed his way after those opening couple of goals, and I was kind of getting irritated because sometimes I just feel like people don't really have a right expectation for what should happen in some of these games. And I think if there was a goal that maybe I'd love for Hellebuck to have saved, it's probably more the Sundqvist one. I think the power play goals that he gave up, I wasn't really too concerned about. But the Sundqvist one, I mean, that's where you maybe hope for like a miracle save. But again, I thought that on the saves that he had to make, especially like the ones on Kyrou and stuff on the breakaway, he showed why he is still a guy that Winnipeg really just puts its faith in. It's why I put the faith in him too. And likewise, I've generally put my faith in Winnipeg's overall play the last few months. I think Winnipeg has really shown the kind of 5v5 game that for years they really haven't had this late into the season. So very excited to see it make its long-awaited appearance. And I think for the Blues, if you're a Blues player and you're trying to figure out how to break this pressure, the only thing that, St. Louis can really do is hit back on counters and catch the Jets being too aggressive. I think the PK was a good example of that, where Winnipeg, maybe pulled itself out trying to chase the play, trying to be, a team that's going to really set the defensive tempo and be aggressive. And in some ways, they actually overextended themselves. I think back to Lowry doing that multiple times in the game yesterday. I look at him as a guy who is usually really calm, very collected, and he's a very smart player. So when you see him maybe overextending himself in a number of different scenarios, that to me is kind of like where maybe some nerves and stuff have set in. Maybe he's overthinking it, trying to do too much, trying to be, the captain in a high stakes playoff game. I think game 2, we're going to see a much more composed Jets team. I think, the early rumbles of game 1 are going to have passed. I think the Blues are going to try and come out again swinging. They certainly did in game 1. Extremely physical, lots of intensity. They really did try to pressure the Jets on the forecheck very quickly. It still wasn't quite enough to really kill the Jets. So I think now that Winnipeg has weathered the early storm, I think the Blues are going to try and do that again, and I don't worry about it so much. I think the Jets have shown in so many instances that time and time again, they just know how to get themselves out of trouble. And increasingly they've shown that, if you go down and you're trailing, it's not as scary of a proposition. So very impressed. I am looking forward to game 2 later this evening. Should be a very exciting one. But of course, the Jets aren't the only team out there that's fighting for their playoff lives. Obviously, the first round has already gotten underway for a lot of other teams, and some of them are in tighter positions than the Jets are. We just saw the end of Vegas versus Minnesota a little bit ago. At least my time, it might have ended your time still on Sunday evening, almost to midnight. But for me, already, well past midnight. So that game, I think, really shows why, the Jets have such a unique opportunity this year to try and go far. Winnipeg has so many, well-balanced attributes over some of these other teams that are maybe struggling to make things happen. And I just think, looking at some of these other teams and opponents, Winnipeg might be the one that can handle so many different matchup problems that some of these top-end teams create. But we'll chat about some of these other early games in the series and some observations from some of the teams that the Jets might have to face over the next couple of months, but we'll dive into that in just a brief moment. Before we do, did want to let you know about our friends and partners at Amazon Fire TV. Did you know your Fire TV is also an Xbox? Turn any TV into your gaming and entertainment hub with Fire TV Stick 4K devices. No console required. Just grab your paired controller, subscribe or sign into Xbox Game Pass Ultimate with EA Play included, and you're ready to play. Dive into hundreds of premium titles from EA Sports College Football 25 to Call of Duty Black Ops 6 or even Avowed. As easily as just stream your favorite shows. It's gaming made simple, and it's all on your Fire TV. It comes with the latest tech for elevated playing, including Wi-Fi 6 and auto low latency mode advanced tech. Amazon Fire TV Stick 4K delivers smoother, more responsive gameplay with lightning fast speeds you need to stay competitive. I play FC25, and so this kind of stuff is really important. Having high responsiveness in a match where you've got very close scoring margins and you can't afford to give up something because of lag, it is crucial. And Amazon Fire TV 4K Stick is great at doing that without even having to have an Xbox. So if you are ready to get started and get a high-quality Xbox gaming experience at the fraction of a cost, head to amazon.com/FireTVLockedOn to get started. Xbox Game Pass Ultimate subscription and compatible controller required. Available on select devices including Fire TV Stick 4K 2nd Gen, Fire TV Stick 4K Max 1st and 2nd Gen, and Fire TV Cube 3rd Gen. Hey friends, and welcome back to these closing thoughts on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we are just wrapping up with some early, I would say, playoff thoughts from the first couple of games. Obviously, Jets Blues, woohoo, big one for the Jets, expecting a big game too. Dallas and Colorado, much more interesting one in my mind for competitive reasons, right? So obviously one of Colorado or Dallas is who we're going to have to face. Colorado did win as expected, but I don't think the game actually played out the way people thought it was going to. I had to miss part of the game, but I was watching the first period or so, and the Stars played pretty well. In fact, I thought that they played some of their best and most well-balanced hockey that they've played in weeks. They could not get past Blackwood, though, and I think the bigger narrative for them is, Robertson obviously is week to week, so that's a huge, huge loss. And Colorado, even if they're maybe not playing their best 5v5 game at any one point, they just have the scoring talent to sort of paper over that. And, the Stars couldn't quite crack the code. So I think game 2 is going to be very tight. I don't think it's going to be a 5-1 scoreline like we saw. I think, Dallas might actually squeak out with a win here. Again, it's going to be tight, but I thought, again, if Dallas can repeat what it did in the opening half of the game and just stay disciplined, avoid getting yourself into trouble and keep your composure, I think that they've got a decent chance of tying the series up. And if you can steal one on the road in Colorado, make the series at least 6 or 7, that makes things very, very interesting. So keep an eye on that series. If Colorado takes the 2-0 series stranglehold early, yeah, probably night-night for the Stars. There's only so much that they can do without Heiskanen and, of course, Robertson. Adontanen's not going to be able to, carry that team to relevancy in some ways. So, they've really leaned on players like Duchesne, Harley, and some fantastic depth guys like Steele. It's just there's a limit to how far you can go against a really cracked veteran team like the Avs are, who have overhauled their center structure. So tough one, but we'll have to see how that one goes. Carolina, New Jersey, pretty lopsided. This is probably at 5v5 the most uneven of the games so far. I know the Toronto-Ottawa scoreline looks really ugly comparatively speaking, but in terms of how the teams actually looked competitively, from what I saw of Carolina and New Jersey, the Devils just didn't even show up. They were really scrambly. They were not until the end of the game, they looked completely outclassed and outworked. The Canes' formula of a really aggressive physical forecheck is not exactly new, and yet the Devils just didn't seem to be prepared for it. So tough one. They also had, a spell without Luke Hughes, who got hurt. He came back, but then Cody Glass basically took friendly fire from Markstrom trying to slash, one of the Canes players and ended up catching Glass instead. No update there. So, yeah, just a brutal start. I think the Devils were probably one of the teams that had one of the hardest opening round games, just because they're hurt, they're beat up. They really don't have, one of their best players in Jack Hughes, and they're still, trying to piece together a defense, even with Hamilton just coming back. So, yeah, not great. But I mean, maybe New Jersey can scrap out a win somewhere, but that feels like it's going to be a pretty short series. Toronto and Ottawa, whew, yeah, what a first game that was. The refs called like 6 billion penalties, and some of them were really, really sketchy with how Toronto was maybe selling a few calls. But I think the bigger narrative for Ottawa is that, they just have a really bad PK, and the lack of discipline and sort of the, I guess, maybe harsh awakening of playoff hockey was a little bit of an eye opener, right? Toronto, may have been outshot and outchanced on paper, but if you look at how Toronto's structure was, they kind of did the same thing that Maurice used to do with the Jets, where they didn't really give up a lot of shot quality, right? They gave up quantity, and maybe the attempts were certainly in Ottawa's favor. But in general, I think the Leafs did exactly what they needed to do to keep the slot relatively protected. Stallars mostly did the rest. And then, Toronto's individual skill took over on a couple of key shifts. And so that to me was really what split this game, and where Ottawa, got themselves into trouble, especially taking repeated penalties. Toronto was able to sort of ride the wave and just, caught, Ullmark on a couple of bad ones. Not, I wouldn't really say this was an Ullmark game that everyone keeps ascribing to him, but yeah, not ideal. I think probably the Nylander and Tavares goals are going to be the ones that he's really upset about, but it is what it is. Ottawa is a wild card team for a reason. I don't know that they're going to be here for too long in this series because Toronto is just very good. But, I wouldn't be shocked if the Sens get, at least 1 or 2 wins here. Last game before, today's stuff starts, obviously, is Vegas, Minnesota. Minnesota, I think, put on a very good show defensively. Offensively, it was a little bit dire outside of the Kaprizov line. Now, the Kaprizov line was almost enough to carry them through, but, you just don't have the depth scoring to keep up with this Vegas team. And, like, on one of the only penalties Minnesota took during, the main portion of regulation, like they got beat really badly off the faceoff. Like 5 seconds into the power play, Vegas has a wide open net and scores. And it's like there's some miscommunication. Somebody missed an assignment. Apparently not the first time it's happened this year to Minnesota. So in a game like this where the margins are so tight and you are facing an extremely veteran, very good Vegas team, mistakes like that are going to kill you. And I just don't think Minnesota, even with Kaprizov and Eriksson Ek back and Bouillon now on the back end, it's just not enough, right? They are now at a competent level, but unless, their bottom six and middle six can really generate more offense, it's really uphill sledding. So I think that they will extend the series a bit. I just don't know if it's enough to maybe go beyond 6, right? It's going to be a really tall ask against a Knights team that just doesn't have that many weaknesses. But out of all these games, let me know which ones really intrigue you the most. Are you going to be watching any of the other opening games? Obviously, I'm thinking Washington will beat Montreal in the opening one, but that could be a surprise. We'll see. Washington's kind of been all over the place recently. And I'm keeping a close eye on LA and Edmonton. I have the Kings really being surprise upset options in that series, but we'll just have to be patient until the opening puck drop. But let me know again which series you're watching, which ones you're excited by, and look forward to seeing you all for Game 2 tonight, and we will have that recap tomorrow. But for tonight's episode, that's all the time that we have. Thanks so much for listening. Have a great night, and as always, go Jets go.